Hello, I'm Sean Lay. Welcome to the programme which brings together leading UK columnists and the foreign correspondents who write, blog and broadcast to audiences in their own countries from the Dateline London. In the studio today are Agnès Poirier of the French news magazine and website Marianne, Michael Goldfarb, former foreign correspondent with the US Public Radio, now host of the FRDH podcast, that's the first rough draft of history, and Catherine Pepinster, who is a former editor of the Catholic newspaper The Tablet and writes in British newspapers on politics, religion and ethics. Welcome to all of you. Lovely to have you here with me. Now, a fratricidal war is how a group of dissenting priests from Russia's Orthodox Church described their country's invasion of Ukraine. It could wreck the spiritual ambition of Kirill, the Patriarch of Moscow and all Rus, to reunite the Church in the two countries, just as it could wreck the political ambition of his sponsor, Vladimir Putin. On the other side of the continent, in France, a country which used the blade of a guillotine to eviscerate the divine right of kings, along with the religion that sustained it, political parties, broad churches during the 20th century, lack believers. And what faith should the British place in a Prime Minister determined by the police to have broken his own COVID law? Lots to talk about this Easter weekend. Catherine, let's start with what's happening in Ukraine. How big a strain is this putting, the war, on the Orthodox Church, the Russian Orthodox Church in particular, and those many millions of, 90-odd million Orthodox Christians?
It's putting increasing strain, I think. It's particularly putting strain on members of the Orthodox Church in Ukraine itself. Already there is a independent Ukrainian Orthodox Church, people who broke away some time ago, and now we're seeing more and more priests who have felt so torn between their country and the Russian Orthodox Church led by Patriarch Kirill. They feel that what Kirill has been doing, endorsing the war, effectively blessing it, making it a holy war, is completely unacceptable, and they too are talking about splitting. I read something today from a theologian in Ukraine who suggested that as many as half of the 12,000 parishes of the Russian Orthodox Church in Ukraine could break away. So this is really significant. There are also some Orthodox priests in Russia itself who have started to be more and more anxious about what's happening. But for them, you can imagine it's extremely tough to speak out. And we're also seeing breakaways as well elsewhere. The Russian Orthodox Church in Amsterdam, for example, has decided it's got to break away from Moscow.
How important has Russian Orthodoxy been to the sort of narrative that President Putin is trying to construct?
It's a very interesting question, Sean, because despite the 50 years when Stalin effectively made Russia an atheist state, it doesn't go away. The Russian Orthodox Church has always been a political player within Russian society, going back into Tsarist times. And unlike in France or in the US or even in the UK, the separation never really happened. And it's really interesting, Vladimir Putin was baptized as a boy, and his dad was a member of the Communist Party, so that really is something. And the priest who officiated at his baptism was Kirill's father. So they have very close connections, and I think that they share a worldview. For Russians, as I understand it, and I have actually, during Glasnow's times, I went to services at Novodevichy Cemetery, where there's a wonderful monastery. And I want to tell you, this side of the holy city of Mashhad in Iraq, I have never encountered, in Iran rather, I've never encountered faith of that intensity. That said, those kinds of worshipers are thin on the ground. However, Russian Orthodoxy is like an essential strand of Russian culture and political life, and essentially always has been. And I think that this is why this combination of Kirill and Putin with a very similar worldview has so much power at the moment and can motivate a country into this war.
It's interesting that you mention how things used to be with Stalin, because of course he did try to really destroy Orthodoxy, but then he changed his mind and he started to realise the usefulness of Orthodoxy, and it's as if Putin has spotted that earlier than Stalin did.
But then, I mean, in Russia, and despite 70 years of communism, the church and the military have always been hand in hand. I think, I mean, I looked at an interview of Putin a few years back when he said that the nuclear weapons or armament was and orthodoxy were the two pillars of the Russian national identity. And of course he was secretly baptized. And when you look at, I mean, and also he built thousands of churches in the last 10 years or so, and not only in Russia but also abroad. It's I mean, you know, orthodoxy, the Russian kind, is a tool of foreign policy. You only have to go to Paris on the river bank. There is this beautiful, very beautiful Orthodox church.
So it's part of Putin's soft power, is it?
Well, completely. But also part of is how, I mean, you know, I think it's 3/4 of Russians who identify as Orthodox. It's part of not only the national narrative, but it's a very conservative you know, tool within Russian society.
I was struck when I visited Moscow a few years ago, Catherine, by the return of the Tsarist icons to the church. So it was almost as if, you know, that almost felt like it was a political statement as well. You know, that kind of strong, almost autocratic leadership is something of value again politically.
And if you go to St. Petersburg, of course, you can now visit the shrines to the Romanovs. You know, they've been consecrated as saints by the Orthodox Church.
It was really interesting in going to that service at the monastery in Orthodoxy was the priests go into the back room. You can hear them singing and they're doing whatever they do, and the ordinary people are just going, making a circuit of the icons, and they're crossing themselves. And the actual heavy lifting is being done in secret, as if it's behind the Kremlin walls, except it's in the back room of this church. It was interesting, the power being used for propaganda purposes, but I double-checked and triple-checked, but it's online, so who can be sure? But at TASS News website, 2 years ago, they noted that on the Moskva, this cruiser which just sank in the Black Sea, they had a golden cross, and embedded in the golden cross was a sliver of the true cross. Now, this was at the TASS News website, so I'm going to say take it with a grain of salt, but nevertheless, the idea that in the 21st century, you would put this forward to your people, that a piece of the true cross is on our flagship in the Black Sea, is to me an astonishing thing.
I mean, the Patriarch Kirill, who is a nasty piece of work, he let his priests bless the bombs, you know, that went to Syria and Crimea. So, well, obviously their prayers weren't strong enough for the flagship Moskva. Right. That didn't save it.
Catherine, it's interesting that Kirill, his title is the Patriarch of Moscow and all Rus. He happens to have been a cartographer, both by training and profession, before he became a priest. Is there a kind of almost a kind of a territorial claim built into that title?
I think there is. I think there's a sense in which he and others in the Russian Orthodox Church see Ukraine, Belarus, Russia as part of one holy place, and that they belong to one another. I mean, they talk sometimes about Ukraine being little Russia, as if it's the little brother, and there is a way almost that the opponents of the war also talk about fraternity, don't they? They've talked about a fratricidal war.
Yes.
There is a closeness between the two countries. There is a proximity, but it's how you express that's obviously so different.
You know, what's interesting is that my two reporting trips in Ukraine were mostly focused in Lviv and Odessa, but certainly in Lviv, this is the stronghold of the Ukrainian Catholic Church, which is not aligned at all with Orthodoxy. It's aligned with the Roman Church. And why not? It was, before it was ever part of Russia, it was part of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and it was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. It is not so simple inside Ukraine. No. It is not a kind of unisectarian place where nationalism intervenes and well, the Russian Orthodox is a bigger brother than this, because it's a much more complicated mix of Christian churches, really, sects.
One last thought for all of you, because you mentioned Roman Catholicism. We'll leave the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, although if anyone is interested in that, BBC Sounds has a great programme from In Our Time recently, the Radio 4 series, which looks at exactly that subject, and it's a really interesting history for those who wonder about democratic powers and consent of the people going back into the Middle Ages. But in terms of the Roman Catholic Church, Pope Francis spoke out. This is Easter weekend for the non-Orthodox. Easter weekend, obviously, for the Orthodox faithful is next weekend. But he spoke out this weekend on Good Friday and made a very pointed statement, Catherine, about the right of people under threat to defend themselves. Now, that can't be a coincidence that he should choose to deliver that message this weekend in the middle of the war in Ukraine.
Absolutely not, and I'm sure that we'll hear more from him this weekend as well during his annual statement he makes to the city and the world, they call it, on Sunday from the balcony at St. Peter's. He will speak about Ukraine, I'm sure of that. What you have to remember about him is that he will make statements to the world. He is trying to be, I guess, be seen as a peacemaker, but behind the scenes there's also Vatican diplomacy going on. And he has the Secretary of State and another Archbishop who will be working, and I know that they have, talking to Russian politicians, Russian ministers, and then also talking to Kirill and his people too. So it's a two-pronged thing. And there are various suggestions about the Pope going to see Kirill at some point. They've talked about him going to Moscow, they've talked about them meeting in Jerusalem, they've talked about him going to Poland. So there are discussions going on about an encounter.
In other words, the Church's diplomatic network is very alive at the moment.
Absolutely, absolutely. And Francis went to this was an unprecedented thing. He went to the Russian embassy to the Holy See early on in the war and to express his displeasure at what was going on.
Let's talk about the other big news this week, which was the French presidential election round 1. And yes, Marine Le Pen and Emmanuel Macron, the obvious winners. Losers include, surely, the two parties that used to provide the president of the Republic, certainly since the change of the constitution back in the early 60s, the socialists and what were the Gaullists, now the Republicans. I mean, their performance, not to put too fine a point on it, was pathetic. Less than 6% between them of those who voted. What's happened to those, what were, as I was saying in the intro, broad churches with huge numbers of faithful?
Well, they've collapsed, they've disappeared, and I don't think they will come back, actually.
Why have they collapsed, do you think? Is it just Macron?
It's a long story that started with the eruption on the political scene in France of the National Front, now known as Rassemblement National. And Jean-Marie Le Pen, you may remember him, is 95, as strong as an oak, was allowed, in a way, to have a voice because of a change of the voting system by the socialist president François Mitterrand. And I remember very well, I was a teenager when the Front National got 35 MPs in the National Assembly. And instead of trying to find out what it meant, yes, and perhaps, grapple with the issue and because it was also the eruption on the national debate of the second generation of North African immigrants, yes, who were French, who were not passing visitors, who wanted to talk about racism, about multiculturalism. And Jacques Chirac,
then the centre-right president. Yeah.
Yes, the right-wing president, but or prime minister of the during the cohabitation with, yes, François Mitterrand.
Not a marriage made in
thought about changing again the no more proportional, because he just wanted to sweep the far-right problem under the carpet. So they haven't had really a voice. I mean, very, very few MPs, 1, 2. But the problem hasn't left, and it's the third time that we're facing with this very stark choice of electing a Democrat, whether he's on the right, on the left, doesn't matter, he's a Democrat, and...
A demagogue, would you say?
A demagogue,
Is that
exactly.
unfair to her?
Oh, no, it's not unfair at all.
And all had the same surname, Le Pen. I mean, this is the 5th in 20 years presidential second round, and 3 of them have had somebody named Le Pen.
Oh, and there are more.
And there are more coming.
And if she's elected, she's already said, actually to a Belgian newspaper, that Jean-Marie will be at the Élysée. And also she's got a niece who's actually much worse than she is. And the whole clan, the whole Breton clan of Le Pen will be in power.
Now,
yes.
All I was going to ask this question is, if Macron wins the second round next month, he can't run again 5 years later. What happens then? Because unless he's going to magic up some kind of successor...
You know, this 5-year timeline, Sean, 3 years ago was there COVID, and 6 months ago we just learned that Russia was building up troops in Belarus and along with it. I think 5 years, you know, it's like John Maynard case. That's the long run where we'll all be dead. In my case, it's entirely possible, actuarially speaking. Look, I don't know. I think that parties do revive. I don't follow socialist politics in France the way I did, you know, when I was going over at the very end of François Mitterrand's
when it still
rule.
mattered.
I mean, and it happens, but they also provide a framework, starting something from scratch, which has happened now. I mean, Emmanuel Macron came out of nothing, and he just invented a party and could win. Is, I think, unusual. And I'm not sure that it's sustainable without a charismatic figure.
It's not sustainable, but the new generation of voters, the ones who are actually putting Macron opposite Le Pen, saying, we don't want to actually go and vote. Okay, that
They've
new
lost
generation.
Faith in the whole political system.
Well, yes, and they are playing with fire, certainly, but they're not interested in party politics. They are interested in movements. They are interested in degrowth. And there's a long-term tendency or trend that started about 30 years ago, and Emmanuel Macron is only the face of that convergence of the bourgeoisie, educated bourgeoisie, from the right and from the left, who are pro-European, who are optimistic, and they want to adapt the model social, or the welfare state, the French model, to globalization. But they have the extreme left and the extreme right, and the more disadvantaged voters sort of circling them. And so we have, in effect, something that is not so democratic, a one-party government with Emmanuel Macron on top. So it's a completely recomposition of the French political landscape. But I don't think the left and the right, the way we've known them, are going to be back.
Can I just pick up this, one last thought on France, Catherine, this movements idea, because Kirill and Putin have effectively stylised the kind of fight against Ukraine. It's not about territory, it's about values, it's about beliefs, it's about the decadence of the West, so the drug-taking, presumably the drug takers that Putin talked about are interchangeable with the gay rights demonstrators that Kirill has talked about.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because
we're the pious ones, they're the decadent ones. You make a choice.
We're seeing a little bit of similar language, I think, from Le Pen, aren't we? When she's talked about the importance of French tradition, she's talked about civilization. It feels like there's some similar language there. This sense of people wanting to embrace some kind of past notion, some value that they feel is being lost. There seems to be a lot of othering going on and a lot of scapegoating. Which is really problematic. It's such negative politics that we're seeing.
And it's been a bit there in some of the attitudes towards, say, the banlieue, for example, hasn't it? Those poorer, disaffected, particularly the young Muslim men and women in France who are French by birth and are French citizens and all the rest of it, but have been treated sometimes in the politics as kind of the other, to be frightened of.
Well, I mean, we've got, it's very interesting how the different religions have been voting, and we have the figures. It's interesting that the Protestants, there are not that many in France, but I think 2.5 million, they voted massively for Macron. I mean, much higher than the average. The Catholics, especially the practicing Catholics, have voted more for Le Pen than the national average and less for the far left, Mélenchon. And the Muslims, the French Muslims, have voted on the first round 69% for the far left candidate. So this is how religion plays out in the French society. But on the other hand, unlike Russia, France is one of the top atheist country in the world, you know. And if you look at people who say they are non-religious or simply atheist, well, they are a bit on the left, on the extreme left, a bit on the extreme right, and a bit Macroniste.
Robespierre's dead, but his spirit lives on. Let me ask you, Michael, in the last 3 or 4 minutes we have about Boris Johnson. Will the British have lost their faith in their Prime Minister as a result of him being fined for breaching his own law on COVID?
You know, it's impossible to tell. And luckily we have the May local elections, and I think you just have to be patient and wait. I think from what I can tell, I know that what we're talking about in France, most people who will sit around this table for any reason will think, oh, you can't do that. You cannot break the rules, the laws you just made in so brazen a fashion, even for a 50 quid fine. But I have a feeling there are a lot of people out in the country at large who think, 50 quid? I got caught speeding the other day and that was 95 quid and 3 points on my license. People will make their own decision about how bad that is. And as for the rest of it, my guess is that it's all priced in now, the way the country feels about Boris. But I do think that there's no election till 2024. So we'll have to wait that long to find out.
Catherine, the interesting thing about that fixed penalty fine, so the analogy with speeding, is that when you look at the debates at the time, part of the reason for that was just they were worried that they'd be so overwhelmed, the police and the courts, especially in the middle of a pandemic, with prosecuting people who'd broken the rules, that they thought this was the most efficient way of doing it. So in other words, it wasn't necessarily a judgment on how serious or not it was was more an administrative decision.
But I'm not sure that many people did break the rules. And I think
in
the end, people were stunned at quite how many parties there were in number 10. I mean, it was a remarkable number. You could say that Boris has been lucky in that something else came along, i.e. Ukraine, to take attention off him. But I wonder if his luck will run out, because we have now a cost of living crisis in this country, and we may well start to see the impact of that when we have the elections in May. That's when people might vote according to their displeasure about that. And as is so often in politics, the economy plays so strongly.
And yes, we used to be rather snooty in this country about French politics on exactly this question about rule breaking and apparently indifference to some of the stricter rules on how you raise funds for election campaigns, who you give job to, all of the rest of it. Is the boot now on the other foot?
Well, look, I think you have to distinguish the British and their government, and I think a lot of people in the world do still highly regard the British. Their government is another story. I mean, I've stopped making predictions. It should have been gone, you know. So many scandals. If you only have to read the ministerial code to know that is not upholding, propriety and integrity, and everything is a British Prime Minister is expected to be doing. So I haven't lost faith in the British. I've lost complete faith in their British Prime Minister, in their Prime Minister, and but it's as long as the Tories back him is here. So, as you're saying, Michael, another 2 years?
Well, they will back him unless they think they have a better candidate.
And they don't at the moment.
Well, surely they must have a better candidate.
Well, I mean,
they got rid of all the Tories.
If the war gets heavy and people get drawn in, then they might have to find a much more serious person. Tom Tugendhat, I don't want to jinx him. I'm just saying.
Chair of the Foreign Affairs.
Chair of the Foreign Affairs.
Former soldier.
You know, but we aren't there, and it's not likely to be that we'll get drawn in.
I have a feeling we're going to be talking about this for weeks to come, not least in a fortnight after those local election results. For now, though, Michael Goldfarb, Catherine Pepinster and Agnès Poirier, thank you all very much. I hope you enjoy your Easter, however you are celebrating. If you are celebrating where you're watching this programme, then a happy Easter to you from all of us on Dateline London for this weekend. Goodbye.